A full quarter year of neon liberalism is up in the cloud, and we are still here for episode number 14. My name's Jason Brigham. I'm an associate editor for Liberal Currents. So is Samantha Hancox-Lee. She's here. And third-time returning guest today, Matthew Downhour, is going to talk with us about Taiwan. And since this is a U.S.-based podcast, also the past and future of U.S. relations with Taiwan. You know, someone from Taiwan, if they're famous enough, can cause an international incident merely by displaying the flag of their country, as, of course, the then 16-year-old K-pop idol Suyu found out in 2015. So a country with a fraught position just off coast of mainland China. And the United States, I don't know, are they turning in the direction of Taiwan and putting their backs toward Europe? This past week, the U.S. government sent a few signals that they are interested in seemingly not having as much to do with Europe as they have in the past. Even though, not counting Russia, Europe has about 600 million people. But today we're going to be talking about Taiwan. Taiwan has about 30 million people. That's about 1/20th the population of Europe minus Russia. But Taiwan is an important country, a free country. It's a powerhouse in technology, particularly in computer chips. But Samantha, I imagine many Americans know less about Taiwan than they might even know about Ukraine.
Yeah, certainly that's been my experience. Part of the reason I wanted to do this podcast was something that happened to me. I was talking with a friend of mine about politics, as one does. This person is very politically active, politically engaged, very well educated. And the subject of Taiwan came up, and, I asked her, well, what do you think? Should we defend them in the case of a war, blah, blah, blah. And she says, well, I don't really know that much about Taiwan. Isn't it a part of China or something? I don't know. And so I was really struck by the lack of knowledge about this, considering, that if you read a little too much national security literature, people seem to think that if World War III starts anywhere, it's going to start in the Taiwan Strait. So trying to reconcile what seems like the geopolitical significance of the island and the kind of lack of knowledge about it, and in the American consciousness anyways, was one of the things I wanted to try and talk about, reconcile today on the podcast. And yeah, you're certainly right that we're seeing a lot of moves in this area from the Trump administration. Trump has always talked about how NATO allies are ripping us off and they're not paying their fair share and blah, blah, blah. He's always been very sympathetic to Russia and Russian interests. And so, like you said, J.D. Vance is in Europe this week.
I was going to say, somewhat surprising. He made an appearance. He did something. We noticed him.
Yeah, someone who is not Elon Musk appears to be taking governmental actions. And the action appears to be trying to basically divest ourselves from supporting Ukraine in order, theoretically anyways, to pivot to Asia, to pivot to Taiwan and confronting China.
Well, so yeah, it is interesting. It's a very, the pivot to Asia, the pivot away from NATO is interesting because it comes back to, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, but looking at the hub and spokes nature of Asian security versus the more collective security model of NATO. I think the idea of NATO has always been a little bit anathema to conservatives in the U.S., even as they enjoy stopping communism or whatever, because NATO is sort of like this universal group of countries. Every country is theoretically equal within NATO. They make unanimous decisions, etc. Now, this pivot to Taiwan puts us in a position where we're acting much more unilaterally with regard to Asia. Well, we have relations with Taiwan, we have relations with Japan, relations with Korea, but it's not like a sort of enmeshed network of security like we're seeing in Europe. That pivot itself is interesting from sort of a philosophical viewpoint as far as how does security work, to put preference on the security arrangements that are essentially bilateral rather than multilateral.
Yeah, so I think the bilateralism is interesting and, has a lot to do with the particular history of the people we're allies with in Asia. And, specifically why none of them wanted to be in an agreement with Japan. There are reasons for that, which we'll probably touch on pretty soon. I think this also, there's the kind of general conservative preference for, like you say, more bilateral, unilateral security commitments, but it also does reflect a general consensus these days that As the military would put it, China is the pacing threat for America. They love that phrase, right? That if we're entering a new era of great power competition, I mean, there's no question that our biggest rival here is China. And so there's some kind of logic to the idea that we need to spend more time on Pacific commitments and preparing for Pacific conflicts. Whether that actually requires us selling out Ukraine and all of Europe, that seems kind of baffling.
Interestingly, Taiwan doesn't think so. The general position from the Taiwanese government has been quite the opposite, right? That the defense of Ukraine is, they see it more as a harbinger of what's going to come in the Pacific, as opposed to a distraction. The U.S. current security apparatus doesn't necessarily think that the Taiwanese know what's in their own best interests. Remember, another recurring theme.
No, I think that's absolutely correct, and I think that's going to be something we come back to. Is, I mean, something you mentioned before about what this all means for the liberal international order and international relations generally. But before we get to any of that, I actually would like to try and do the thing that I said I was going to do, and like talk about what is Taiwan and why do people think it really matters quite so much. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the history of Taiwan. This is going to be the real Sparks Notes version because it's all like a very interesting and important history, but we only have so much time here, and it's mostly, useful as background for understanding where we are today. All right, so like Jason said, Taiwan is an island off the coast of China. It's a pretty large island off the coast of China. In prehistoric times, it's settled by a variety of different tribes and peoples. These are the indigenous peoples of Taiwan. They're still around in one form or another. Sometime in the 1600s, various colonial powers start poking around the edges. The Dutch have a settlement on Taiwan. The Japanese have an expedition to Taiwan. But the people who actually conquer the place are the Qing dynasty. They sail across the Taiwan Strait, they establish their own colony there, and over the next couple hundred years, there's a substantial amount of, what we would just call settler colonialism, as Qing farmers, Han farmers, migrate across the Taiwan Strait, settle more of the arable land, build farms and plantations, and drive the indigenous peoples more and more into the mountains. That goes on for a couple hundred years. In 1895, Japan, the Empire of Japan now, conquers the place, kicks the Qing out completely, and basically says it's ours now, and we're going to do even more colonialism. And because in many ways, they're really modeling what they're doing here on what they see European empires doing. Right, this is the era where Japan is saying, well, if we want to be a great nation, we have to do what all the other great nations are, which is conquer a big empire and make colonies and extract resources. So they conquer it in 1895. Meanwhile, back on the mainland, this is going to be important later, the Qing state is basically imploding, being carved up by the various Western powers, descends into an era of warlordism and civil war, which eventually shakes out into basically two sides. The nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, led by Mao. That's all happening in the background here. Meanwhile, back on Taiwan, the Japanese use it as a huge fleet base for various reasons during World War II. Then they lose World War II, you might have heard. And in 1945, they agree to give Taiwan back to China, although which side they don't really specify. In practice, it goes back to the nationalists. The nationalists, a few years later, lose the Civil War. You might have heard about that as well. Yeah, that's a lot of history skipping over. It's really a fascinating period. But the important part is that the nationalists lose. They lose tremendously out in Manchuria. They get their armies basically annihilated by the communists. They retreat south. The communists come after them. They retreat more. The communists keep on coming. And eventually, the nationalists, their entire army, their army's families, their families' families, their bureaucrats, everybody who isn't basically, would get murdered if the communists found them and who can manage it, leaves the mainland and goes to Taiwan.
If I'm recalling correctly, much of the treasury, right, of China that they can grab to sort of establish a new state on that foundation.
They wouldn't. This is actually kind of important. They would not have said that they were establishing a new state. They would not have said that they were stealing the treasury. right? They would have said, this is our treasury. And
The treasury, right? They are the
in
republic.
fact, they do say, like, we're just, this is the treasury of China. And it isn't, this part's important. This gets to why Taiwan is still kind of a disputed territory today in important ways, is the policy of Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the nationalists, is we're going to be right back. Any day now, we're going back to the mainland. We're going to reconquer China. And that's his policy, through the Korean War, through, the 50s and the 60s. It's like any day now, we're going to take China back. And it will always have been one China, and we will always have been the legitimate government of China.
Hey, it happened in Syria. So just because it didn't work out for Chang, we shouldn't,
Well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of an important part of the story, right? Is that it doesn't, if you're looking at the world in 1949, the future is unwritten. But what actually happens is that the Chinese completely consolidate the mainland.
But both of these guys, the literally Mao and Chiang, both live into the mid 70s. Like, I feel like that's also part of it. It is literally the same two guys who fought the Civil War are also sort of these rivals well into, well, as we'll talk about, well into sort of Nixon's visit to China. It's not like these are the same parties. These are literally the same people who have this kind of shifting relationship for what, half the Cold War.
No, I think that's exactly right. That really prevents any kind of change in the relationship, because Mao and Chiang have known each other since forever and hate each other for obvious reasons. And so, yeah, I'm not going to talk too much about what's happening on the mainland. What happens in Taiwan in this period is basically, they're a military dictatorship, right? They don't have elections. Chiang is the general and the president and the supreme leader of the Kuomintang, which is the party system that he leads, that is also an army, blah, blah, blah. Right, and it's like, yeah, you could look at this from the perspective of the Cold War and say, and they're another right-wing authoritarian that America is aligned with because we don't like communism very much, right? Much as is happening in Korea at the same time as is happening in innumerable other places in Latin America and other parts of the world. Then things start to change a little bit in Taiwan, that they start to go through a period of rapid economic growth. They're one of the Asian tigers under the Kuomintang. And then, after a certain point, there's increasing mass resistance to the dictatorship. And the dictatorship basically self-abolishes, right? The last general of the Kuomintang is also the first democratically elected president, because he just democratizes the country without going through, a horrific civil war. And they become a democracy, a liberal democracy in point of fact, as they seem to be today. Meanwhile, and this is going to be important, you kind of hinted at this with Nixon, where one of the major moves in the Cold War is the Sino-Soviet split, where the Soviets and the Chinese always had kind of a bit of a rivalry for who's going to be the leader of world communism. They have kind of an unsettled border themselves in a couple of places. They actually almost go to nuclear war during this period, which is pretty wild. And Nixon kind of reaches out to the Chinese and he says, we're willing to do business. And this is a period when the Chinese are also very interested in doing business. And so there's this huge split between the Soviets and the Chinese. There's the opening of China to markets to the West, under Deng Xiaoping. This is going to lead to enormous economic growth in China. But you can kind of see what happens here, which is that America, at this point, we look at Taiwan, which is a tiny island, and China, which is a giant country of 1 billion people. And one of them we've been allied with for decades, and one of them we really want to ally or be friends with right now because it'll mess up the Soviets. And so we kind of do this thing where we just, decide to have it both ways. And there's this policy of strategic ambiguity, that we're just not going to say who's the rightful government of China, right? We're going to say, of course, like everybody, we all agree that the Chinese and the Taiwanese and the Americans, we all agree there's only one China. And nobody asks us which China is the one China. And so this general ambiguity over the status of Taiwan in terms of international law and American recognition, is it a sovereign and independent country, or is it a subject of China, or is it China the subject of it? Is like that's deliberately left unanswered during the Cold War and
and in some ways, with Deng's liberalization, this is also to the benefit, I mean, of both mainland China and Taiwan. There's sort of an economic symbiosis there where many Taiwanese firms are investing in China in a way that they probably wouldn't be able to do. Obviously, wouldn't be able to do if Taiwan were formally independent. But at the same time, this is economically beneficial to them, having access to the Chinese market, to China having access to this capital and expertise. And so even as they're rivals, that sort of odd symbiosis forms between Taiwan and China, where also neither the Chinese nor the Taiwanese particularly want to upset the status quo, even though it's sort of a logical absurdity of this one China. It makes a lot of economic sense to act like that's also the case.
No, that's right. So Deng Xiaoping has this famous phrase during the period: it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white as long as it hunts mice. And what he's talking about is making money, right? And he's like, yeah, we have all our political differences and this or that and the other thing, but like, who cares? If business is good, we're all going to be better off.
No, I was just going to say, just to be really clear, for the listeners who maybe aren't quite exactly familiar with the timing, it's like Taiwan has its industrialization, its period of like big economic takeoff. That's in the 60s, right? And for China, it doesn't really kick in until the 80s, So like this idea of like, connecting to Taiwan, benefiting from the expertise and like, borrowing ideas, technologies, whatever, makes sense when you think that Taiwan has like a 2-decade lead economically in some sense.
No, that's right. So Taiwan goes through a period of rapid industrialization. They make a ton of money. They develop a lot of new technology and industry. And then, as has been happening in a variety of countries in Asia, they call this the flying geese theory. Then they take that money and they invest it in the next country to start developing. And that country is China, right? And so for a while there, everybody's happy. Right, because everybody's making money and no one has to concede anything in terms of the actual like legal strategic how many Chinas are there questions. No one has to actually talk about any of that. And yeah, that kind of brings us to the present day.
It's getting there, one thing we can add if we want to, turn our attention a little bit more tightly to Taiwan, is something that's made Taiwan extremely relevant in recent years, is that since 2000, Taiwan has become an absolutely dominant player in computer chip manufacturing. The chips.
We have to talk about the chips.
Everyone has to talk about the chips these days. We lived through the pandemic in the United States. Everyone, a lot of people know that the chips ran into short supply, and maybe even a few people have a vague sense that this has something to do with Taiwan. It has a lot to do with a Taiwanese company called TSMC, which starting, right around 2000, rose over the next couple decades and to become, again, the leading chip producer in the world. And they did it by specializing in the manufacture of the chips, right? So they manufactured chips to the specific designs of their customers, which would have been various tech companies, and then increasingly more as TSMC got better and better at the manufacturing, right? So the designs of the chips by the customers of TMC were, of course, important trade secrets for those companies. So something, in the story of TSMC, something that's I think important to understand is they had to gain the trust of all these various customers. Like, okay, we're going to manufacture your chip, but we're not going to like let your competitors, we also manufacture their chips, and we're not going to let them know about the design of your chips and things like that, right? But once you start manufacturing whole various numbers of chips and various designs and stuff, you get just, they became super experts, and their manufacturing became far better, basically, than any other firm in the world. So they had this enormous technological lead that drew them even more customers, and they just reached this point of being super dominant, basically. But that level of power attracted a significant response from governments, let's say, particularly China, particularly the United States. The US government leaned on TSMC. they asked them to start manufacturing some chips in the United States, which they actually did in Arizona. And then in the wake of the pandemic, I said, we know about the supply chain problems. The U.S. government under Biden started saying to TSMC, hey, will you tell us a lot about your supply chain and things like that so we can start becoming more, figure out what we've got to do to make sure things don't break down? And remember, TSMC, relative to their customers, is kind of always in this delicate position of like, not, saying, oh, your information is safe with us. We're not going to put it out there to give it to your competitors, even though we work with them too. And now you had the U.S. government like saying, hey, turn over a bunch of information to us about your supply chain. So they've run into, becoming so dominant in this crucial industry has made them a real political football. There was even some sort of U.S. Defense memo. I don't know exactly what it is. I can't remember this, but there's something about the U.S. military plans for potential situations that might develop and considering whether TSMC would have to be a specific target in some sort of, conflict or something.
Well, I believe that this is the official, or at least the stated position of Elbridge Colby, right? That if things were to go down in the Taiwan, so Elbridge Colby has been nominated.
The strategy chief.
Yes, he's been nominated to some position in the Trump administration, right? Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. His position is that in the event that it appears likely that China will annex Taiwan, that the United States should actually unilaterally destroy TSMC's foundry, like bomb them.
I mean, what a nightmare.
This is his actual position. And if he's the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, that this could become the U.S. contingency policy. It's an extreme, and here I think we get to this shift from a much more liberal point of view that we support democracy and prosperity together. We hope that we can build these multilateral, peaceful coalitions, but in the end, we stand by our allies. To Taiwan's not really our ally, right? They're the location of this foundry, and we are taking it upon ourselves to control it if we can and destroy it if we can't, which is a extremely rapid departure from anything resembling an ideal of democracy or a rules-based
I think that's
ask yourself why Taiwan would struggle to welcome this idea that the United States is pivoting to protect them when there's literally some memo from a couple of years ago and people in the United States talking about destroying their number one company.
Right.
Yeah, so I think it really reflects a shift towards an imperialist logic that we've seen from the Trump administration in a lot of ways, some of which we've talked about here on neoliberalism. But basically, this is talking about seeing chips kind of along the lines of a strategic resource, oil, the way people used to think about oil as this overriding strategic concern, right? Because in some ways it's true. Chips are in everything, right? They are in your cell phone, they are in your computer, they're in your microwave, they're in your car, they're in everything, they're in your tools. If you use any kind of industrial equipment, they're in every piece of high-end military hardware. They're kind of foundational to the modern world. And something like 80% of the advanced stuff of everywhere in the entire world is made in factories in Taiwan. And so there's this idea, right, that we've got to control, and if we can't have it, no one can, that you see kind of emanating from Washington these days.
Think about what you just said. 80% of the world's chips come from this place, and some people who are now high up in the U.S. government, or could be, and they're talking about, in the event of war, we'll blow it up. That tells you war. I guess that's the reality of war, but that's a horrendous reality.
Scorched earth is a rough tactic, but then you're going to go scorched earth on someone else's country. So your ostensible ally, is I would say not the way to build a firm partnership there. And importantly, so that the chips themselves are manufactured in Taiwan, right? But the process is largely controlled or I guess invented by a Dutch company that actually produces the things that produce the chips. And there again, so at least to my mind, again, this pivot away from Europe and towards the Pacific, when a major part of Biden's policy has been working with this company, ASML, to control the spread of this technology, right? So to my mind, again, these things are interconnected in probably a troublingly few number of hands, right? It would probably be ideal if two companies didn't form the foundation of the modern world. But in so much as they do, I would say those issues are pretty closely interlinked.
Yes. So, I mean, we can talk about the economics of chips and why this has led to a certain degree of market concentration, but that's maybe a different podcast. I think you're right to really emphasize that chips aren't oil, right? They're not just sitting there in the ground and anyone can just go show up and pull them out, right? A chip is an industrial and a technological product of an enormous integrated global supply chain, right? There's a company, a Dutch company that makes the, photolithography machines, but they source their parts for their photolithography machines from all over Europe and all over the world. And, what makes chips is not, like I said, they're not like a physical store of them in the ground, but it is a social construct, right? A great assemblage of people all working together that continually produces these things. And the kind of imperialist attitude that Trump is bringing to the world is just totally destructive of.
Yeah, there was this story in the past week that the Trump administration goes to Ukraine and demands half their mineral resources. I mean,
It's completely insane.
You're certainly not going to go to Taiwan and demand half the chips because they're not just sitting there. They're being continuously made in a process that requires this expertise and this community, really, of people who have developed this expertise in community, working with other people for now 25 years or more. And you wreck it and it's just gone. I mean, these two companies, this Dutch company that you mentioned, Matthew, and TSMC, they're at the top because they know what they're doing, and they know what they're doing because they've spent 25 years figuring it out.
And to a great extent, I mean, just what we were talking about TSMC, like the way they deal with trade secrets and all that. I mean, that's not really replicable if you don't have a pretty strong rule of law and property rights regime, right?
Absolutely.
You're not going to recreate that in a country where the government can just seize intellectual property, right? Nobody's going to contract like that.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, it is it's a sort of crystallization of where, a lot of these liberal ideas, at least in the broadest sense, are necessary to create a company. And as we move into maybe a more imperialist era, it's possible that a lot of that withers, right? Or at least we stop seeing the advancements in technology and in production that we've for the last couple of decades.
I think that's right. One thing I do want to talk about here is, as much as, it's kind of standard here to bag on the Trump administration, rightly.
I was going to say,
not as if
it is.
Trump is really creating the conflict in Taiwan, right? Trump is not the reason that Taiwan is looking around for allies. And this gets back to, again, events on the mainland, right? That in the 80s and 90s, China goes through a really explosive period of economic growth. And, the communists are still very much communists, but communism as an ideology of worldwide revolution that can unite a people together is just very few people really believe that, right? And so increasingly, since the implosion of the USSR, leaders in China have been turning harder and harder towards nationalism, towards specifically Han nationalism, as a way of justifying their rule. And as economic growth starts to run into some headwinds, then they have started to lean even harder on Han. Han is the dominant ethnicity in China, by the way. Han nationalism. And they've started to assert that, they own all the stuff that all the empires of China ever asserted a claim to. So, for example, what's known as the 9-dash line. It's just a line on a map that has 9 dashes in it, but those 9 dashes encompass almost all of the South China Sea, including lots of stuff that the Philippines and Vietnam and Japan consider to be theirs. And so, there's this tendency that, there's this belief kind of fostered by China, that they're pursuing a more aggressive imperialist policy towards their own neighbors, right? And we've seen Xi Jinping talk about this, right? Talk about the idea of what's the line? The rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, that they're going to recover from, the century of humiliation and finally reattain their place in the sun. There's been talk about what's this other phrase that gets bandied around? Great changes not seen in a century, which is pretty ominous if you think about what was happening about a century ago.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think this really touches on what Matthew really wants to talk about in terms of the liberal international order and the alternatives to it.
Yeah, it sounds like they want to paint the map.
It sounds a lot like they want to paint the map.
As
we all know, Trump wants to paint the map. He wants to paint Greenland and
I was going to say
Canada and Canada and this total madness. But there is a similar madness that's you can see simmering beneath the surface in China, where they want to, they have reasserted control over Hong Kong, and they want to reassert control over Taiwan.
And this, I think, it gets, again, back to the weakness of not having a network security structure, right? China has a pretty sharp conflict with the Philippines. It's come to boats threatening each other and what have you. At the same time as they have territorial disputes with, obviously, with Taiwan. They have some disputes around with Japan, but these conflicts are all sort of one-on-one, right? There is no NATO that says, all of these countries recognize their largest, neighbor and potential threat. Not that it has to be a combative relationship, but in the event that it is, in Europe, right, most European countries have created this or belong to a structure that has them work together. As we've seen in Ukraine, it has them work together, somewhat effectively, even for a country that's not part of NATO. There is no comparable structure in it. And in some ways, the rivalries or historical differences or whatever between different countries that might feel threatened by Chinese expansionism don't have institutions that would link them together or link their different potential conflicts together in sort of a mutually supporting way.
No, that's exactly right. China has conflicts with basically all of its neighbors, right? That in the high passes of the Himalayas, there have been kind of actually quite lethal skirmishes between Chinese and Indian troops. Bizarrely, they've done this thing where they don't shoot at each other. But they do go out on patrol with spears and clubs and beat each other to death occasionally.
Right. It's sort of the weird understanding. We don't bring guns.
Yeah, that one's interesting.
But yeah, extremely violent, like you said. Although the sort of mutual understanding is they don't bring guns. It's still a violent conflict.
Yeah, if there are no guns, it's not a war.
Apparently.
Right. So China has they have conflicts with Russia over an island in a river in the middle of nowhere. This is actually the island that almost kicked off a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and China back in the day. It's Damascus/Zhenbao Island, right? They have conflicts with Japan. They have conflicts with Taiwan. They have conflicts with the Philippines. To the extent that they're propping up North Korea, you might think that they have certain conflicts with South Korea. But none of these countries are, have all their own disagreements with each other. Obviously, a lot of people in Asia are still very unhappy with Japan over some things. Sorry, I shouldn't put it so euphemistically. The Imperial Japan was a nightmare and was enormously bad for the various people that they conquered. Right, but what knits them all together today is the United States. Right, that the United States is a bilateral agreement with Japan and a bilateral agreement with Korea and a bilateral agreement with the Philippines and a bilateral agreement with Australia. I guess Australia, it's trilateral because the UK is kind of in it these days. Anyways, sorry. This whole weird mess of interlocking agreements and alliances that is not actually unified into any kind of regional alliance structure.
And to get back into bashing the Trump administration, which we are definitely going to do consistently on neon liberalism, into this steps the competent new Trump era.
So competent.
Leaders such as Secretary of Defense Hegseth, who does not know what countries are in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, right? So
right. We're pivoting to Asia, but we're not bringing our best people.
We are bringing some of the worst. The most ignorant,
the absolute worst,
most incompetent.
Yeah.
And with that, I think you can say it is an open question to what extent the U.S. can make any positive difference with its interests and its philosophy aligned as they currently are, right? Is the U.S. more likely to inflame tensions? And I think someone like Albert Colby is more likely to inflame tensions than to have any persuasive deterrent effect that might maintain peace in East Asia, a la NATO and Europe. The U.S. doesn't seem, for a variety of reasons, the U.S. doesn't seem to be in a position to have the non-tangible resources, right? The expertise, the diplomatic legitimacy to step in at this juncture.
I think you can go so far as to say, is it even credible that the U.S. is on the side of Taiwan as opposed to on the side of the PRC? I mean, does Donald Trump personally tend to align with democracies, or does he tend to align with dictators?
I mean, I think he's super racist, so that will maybe have certain tendencies here. But I think you get to an important point here, where Hegseth was recently interviewed, and someone asks him, "Well, what do you think about the values of the Atlantic system?" And he said, "Well, strength is more important than values." And I mean, it sounds nice, but I don't think it's true, right? Then you can see people like Colby. I mean, we've talked about this imperial logic, this return to this idea of like a very, very transactional foreign policy. And the people who advocate for these very transactional foreign policies seem to say, well, it'll be better for everybody, it'll be more stable because we're all being more honest about our interests. And I think this is fundamentally an ahistorical point of view, right? Because we can look at history and see that there have been alliance structures that were very transactional and were built purely on, the contingent confluence of mutual interest. And we can also see how they end, which is that all these people go to war with each other, right? World War I, for like to take just one example from a long, long history, nominally, Italy is allied with Germany and Austria, but then World War I starts and they kind of sit it out, and then they look at which way the wind is blowing, and they say, actually, we're joining the Western Allies because we want to take a bite out of Austria and the Balkans, right? That's going to be their reward. For switching sides, they're going to lose a few million men and gain a couple cities on the Adriatic coast.
And I think that the pre-World War I system, right, is extremely relevant here, right? It's largely what's being reproduced is this sort of system of shifting alliances where, yeah, like you said, countries are just saying, like, these are my interests, and drawing a sharp delineation between great powers and other powers, right? Where, Canada doesn't count for anything, we can just try to push them around. Denmark doesn't count for anything, we push them around. And then that is to get back to Jason's point, that is what worries me, right? That, if there are material interests that Trump has with the PRC, that might win out over the needs or desires of the people of Taiwan, just as it did with any of these imperial negotiations before the Great War. And as you're saying, people will call that stable, but it's really not, right? It's the best you can say of this sort of concert of Europe, multilateral or multipolar order, is that it's pushed the great powers' attention to conquering the minor powers for several decades, before ultimately exploding again in the 1850s and then in the World War I. It does not seem to be a stable order, but it is one that's very attractive to leadership and especially to autocratic.
Putting aside what might be the most ludicrous idea I have contemplated lately, the idea that the American right wing sees something good about honesty. Let's all be honest with one another, and this will lead to a great international order. These are some of the most dishonest people ever. They have no practice being honest. But putting that aside, earlier in this podcast, we were talking about strategic ambiguity, which seemed like a policy success for the United States for quite a while. How honest was that? That was not a policy based on, let me reveal my truest self to you, foreign nations. And just from any element of thinking strategically about military policy or foreign policy, let me be honest and reveal my truest, deepest self to you, foreign nations, does not seem like the number one approach that you want to take for success.
No, I mean, I think this is striking. I mean, like, if you look at stuff that happens pre-World War I, there's an enormous amount of the secret alliances where nations are making these secret agreements with each other to join in war under this circumstance or that circumstance. And like that's like one of the things that people really want to ban after World War I because they think that it led pretty directly to that particular catastrophe. And I think it's important like this kind of like gets to the like people talk about material interest. Oh, that's going to be a solid foundation, but like material interests are ephemeral, right? 30 years ago, no one would have thought of Taiwan's microchips as a central strategic resource, and 30 years from now, who knows what the central strategic resource is going to be, right? If we successfully build, I mean, like clearly the goal of the Trump administration is we're going to build as many chip fabs in America as possible, and then we're just going to not care about Taiwan, and we can sell them out to China for some concession, right? Like this is just transparently what they are actually going to do, right? That material interests can shift and change, and the balance of power can shift and change, and that creates all these security dilemmas where now everybody needs to be really heavily armed in case of war, in case of a shift in the winds. And I want to contrast this with NATO. Right. The thing about NATO is that it was based on, a shared security interest defending themselves against communism, basically, the conquest by the Red Army, but also it was based on shared values, right? On a shared commitment to liberal democracy. Yeah, and there's some qualifications and little gray areas in there, but broadly speaking, a community of shared values proved to be much more stable, right? That's the whole thing, is that Germany and France and England, who spent centuries being worried about the other two joining up to gang up on them, like they just stopped, right? They just stopped on a dime. The English stopped being worried that the French were going to come conquer them, and the French stopped being worried that the Germans were going to come conquer them, and the Anglo-German naval race just evaporates because of this community of shared values, which is, I mean, we're seeing a pretty serious challenge to it today, but seems to have proven much more durable, more solid foundation for peace than this imperial logic that we seem to be returning to.
So is there any U.S. policy that can move us in a better direction? I guess that is the question, right? Like, not this administration, probably. What comes next? Obviously most of it has to come from the people in the region themselves, but how should the U.S. be relating to Taiwan especially, but East Asia generally? What does a successful pivot to Asia?
Yeah, I mean, if you're asking my answer to that question, if I had been elected president a few months ago, I mean, I would talk more about an explicitly pro-democracy foreign policy. Right, that what is America going to do in the world? We're going to defend democracies, right? That means, yes, Ukraine, it's not in NATO, but we believe in defending them. Taiwan, they might not be a member of the United Nations, but they're a free democratic people, and they need defending against their authoritarian neighbor. And at the same time, to just like try and back off a little bit on some of our commitments to defending people who are democracies and who are authoritarians, and our bizarre military adventures in places like Iraq, trying to impose democracy at the point of a sword in the most incompetent way possible. I don't know if that's an answer that you want to hear, but it's my answer.
I mean, it's exactly the answer I want.
Well, it's the shared values answer. That's, it's totally of a piece with what you were just saying, Samantha.
No, and I think, I mean, this is actually one of my own dissatisfactions with, you don't actually hear a lot of foreign policy professionals talk about the liberal international order. They talk about the rules-based international order. And I think that's a mistake, because the reason you talk about the rules-based international order is because you want to let authoritarians in. You want to say, well, it's fine if you're a dictator who imprisons a few 100,000 of your own people for thought crime, but as long as you don't mess with the boats, you're totally nation in good standing. And I find that, frustrating, because it's not true, and we shouldn't pretend like it is. That doesn't mean we should be going around and invading every dictatorship out there. But I don't think we should be acting like that's a totally fine and normal situation that we should support just the same way as we support any other democratic nation.
Well, here on Neon Liberalism, we're going to keep talking about the liberal international order, and frankly, whatever we think might any kind of step toward an improvement
How to get
in
back to
our
it.
world and our country.
How to get it back, right?
If you enjoy what we're doing, maybe you enjoy the excellent articles published on our parent publication, that's liberalcurrents.com. We invite your support at patreon.com/liberalcurrents. It's a website that's on its way to bigger and better things. At least it is with your support. Well, thank you, and we will be seeing you again next week.